He had not opened his door for anyone in 3 years. Then one night, his dog came home alone in the rain with a note tied to her collar that read, "Please, don't call 911. If you believe some people find each other exactly when they are supposed to, subscribe and stay." The kind of quiet that settles over the Cascade Range in late October is not peaceful. It is deliberate, like a held breath that never quite releases into something easier. Ethan Cole had come to understand that distinction over the course of 3 years living alone at the edge of Ridgeback Lake, 18 miles from the nearest town, in a cabin that smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, and the particular loneliness of a man who had stopped expecting anything from mornings. He was 42 years old, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped dark hair going gray at the temples, and eyes the color of deep river water, steady, observant, and almost never surprised, because surprise required a degree of openness he had learned to budget carefully. He had been a profiler for the FBI for 14 years, and for most of those years, he had been very good at it, the kind of good that earned quiet respect in conference rooms and uncomfortable silences at dinner tables, because reading people accurately was not always a gift others appreciated receiving. The work had given him purpose and structure, and the particular satisfaction of a mind that found patterns where others saw noise, and for a long time that had been enough. Then came the Harlow case, and enough stopped being enough. He had identified the right man, he was certain of that, even now, but the timeline he constructed had been built on information that had been quietly, deliberately withheld by a supervisor whose retirement paperwork was already filed, and by the time Ethan understood what was missing, a woman named Sandra Pruitt was already gone. He never read past the executive summary of the internal review. He submitted his leave request the following morning and drove north without a plan, following the highway until the highway thinned into roads, and the roads thinned into gravel, and the gravel ended at a lake no one had bothered to name on most maps. The cabin had belonged to his uncle, unused for a decade, and Ethan had spent the first 2 weeks simply making it livable, replacing boards, sealing gaps, stacking wood, because physical work demanded exactly enough attention to crowd out everything else. That was 3 years ago. Bureau had eventually reclassified his leave as mandatory administrative recovery. 90 days of what the HR paperwork called structured reintegration, and assigned Agent Dana Polk to conduct passive observation in the program's final phase. 6 weeks of direct field monitoring, following an initial period of remote records review. Ethan did not know about Dana Polk. He knew about Raven, who was 4 years old and 58 pounds of black and tan German Shepherd with amber eyes that held a quality he had never quite been able to name, something between vigilance and tenderness that made her seem, on quiet evenings, like the only creature in the world who fully understood the terms of their arrangement. He knew about Finn, Raven's 4-month-old pup, whose paws were still too large for his body and whose curiosity outran his coordination on a daily basis, and who had a talent for finding the single most inconvenient place to fall asleep in any given room. His days followed a rhythm that asked nothing of him beyond presence. Wake before light, feed the dogs, split wood until his shoulders burned, walk the eastern trail along the lake's edge in the gray morning air, eat whatever required the fewest decisions, read until dark, sleep without dreaming if the night was cooperative. It was not happiness. Exactly. He had stopped using that word for himself some years ago, but it was manageable, and manageable was a thing he had learned not to underestimate. The rain had started around 7 in the evening, not violent, but insistent, the kind that found every small gap in a roof and reminded you of everything that needed doing before winter arrived in earnest. Ethan had added a second log to the stove and was sitting in the chair closest to it, a cup of coffee balanced on his knee, not reading the book open in his lap, when Raven stood up from her place by the door and pressed her nose to the gap at the base of it with a low, focused whine that was nothing like the sounds she made when she wanted food or attention or to be let out for ordinary reasons. He watched her for a moment, the way he watched most things, quietly, without moving, letting the information arrive at its own pace. She pawed the door once, deliberately, and looked back at him with an expression that he had no precise word for, but recognized in the same way he recognized certain silences in interrogation rooms. Something is wrong, and I need you to understand that before you decide not to act. He stood and opened the door, and she was gone before he could call her name, swallowed immediately by the dark and the rain and the sound of water moving through the trees. He stood in the doorway for a moment, holding the door open while cold air replaced warm, and Finn pressed anxiously against his leg from behind, too young and uncertain to follow, but too attached to retreat. Ethan called twice. Nothing came back except the rain. He waited. 40 minutes later, he had checked his watch at the door, and again, when he heard the scratching, Raven was back, alone, her coat soaked and darkened, her breathing fast and shallow, and she did not come inside when he opened the door. She stood on the porch, looked at him, looked back toward the tree line, and then looked at him again with the same focused, unambiguous communication she had used before, except that this time it was louder in the way that silence can be loud, insistent in a way that reached past his habit of caution and touched something older and more direct. He saw the damp piece of cloth knotted around her collar before he fully registered what it was. He crouched in the doorway and worked the knot loose with his fingers, and when he unfolded it and held it toward the light from inside the cabin, 4 words were written in handwriting that had started neat and ended desperate. "Please, don't call 911. He read it twice. The instinct to reach for his phone was immediate and trained, and the instinct to pause came from a different kind of training, the kind that had taught him that when a victim of sustained control asks you specifically not to involve the system, there is almost always a reason rooted in prior harm, and overriding that request without understanding it is not help. He pulled on his jacket, took the flashlight from the hook by the door, told Finn to stay in a voice that carried enough weight that the pup retreated 2 steps and sat, and followed Raven into the rain. She led him at a pace that was neither slow nor reckless, pausing every 30 or 40 yards to look back, then continuing with the focused directness of a working dog on a known route. The beam of his flashlight caught roots and wet rock and the steady fall of rain through the pines, and he moved carefully, matching her rhythm, his breath fogging the cold air. It took just under 10 minutes. The flashlight found her, a young woman sitting with her back against the broad base of a Douglas fir, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around a small bag pressed to her chest, her head tilted back against the bark and her eyes closed, her dark hair plastered against a face that was pale and exhausted in equal measure. Raven went to her immediately and lay down at her side, pressing the full length of her body against the woman's leg, and the woman's eyes opened slowly, not with the jolt of fear Ethan half expected, but with the dull, careful alertness of someone who had been conserving the last of something and was now deciding whether to spend it. He carried her back, not because she asked him to, but because her left ankle gave out on the first step she attempted, and she accepted his arm with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that resisting help in physical emergencies was a luxury she could not currently afford. She did not speak on the walk back, and he did not fill the silence, because he understood by then that silence was not the absence of communication, it was a form of it. And what this one was saying was, I am deciding how much to give you, and I need you to not rush that decision. He set her on the cot near the stove, stepped back to the far side of the room, and put the kettle on without asking, because offering warmth before asking questions was something he had learned early in his career was almost always the right sequence. She watched him move around the small space with eyes that cataloged exits and objects and distances in a way he recognized immediately, not paranoia, but the systematic environmental assessment of someone who had learned that rooms could change character without warning, depending on who else was in them. He kept his movements slow and visible, never crossing the distance between them without announcing it first. She said her name was Claire, that her car had broken down on Route 47, that she had been walking when she got turned around in the dark. He listened to all of it with the same expression he wore during depositions, attentive, unreactive, and when she finished, he nodded once and set a mug of hot water near her without comment. He did not say he knew she was lying. The point was that she was cold and hurt and had written 4 words on a piece of cloth and trusted them to a dog, And whatever the full shape of the truth was, it would not arrive faster by being demanded. What he noticed instead, what arrived quietly and without his permission, settling in his chest with the particular weight of professional recognition, was the way she flinched when he stood too quickly. Not dramatically, not even visibly to most observers. A micro-contraction of the shoulders, a brief closing of the eyes, a tensing around the jaw that lasted less than a second before she controlled it back to neutral. It was the reflex of a body that had learned to prepare itself without conscious instruction. He had seen it before in interview rooms, in shelters, in the back seats of bureau cars, and he recognized it the way you recognize a song you haven't heard in years, not by thinking about it, but by the way it lands somewhere familiar before your mind catches up. He said nothing. He went to the chair on the far side of the stove and sat down and opened his book to a page he had no intention of reading. And after a while, the kettle hummed and the fire settled, and Raven, without instruction or invitation, stood from her place near the door and walked to the cot and lay down beside Claire with a slow, deliberate ease that said, "You are safe here, and I have decided that, and my decisions in this regard are not negotiable." Claire looked down at her for a long moment. Then she set her hand on Raven's side, very lightly, as though she were testing whether something would be taken from her for doing it. Nothing was. Ethan turned a page he had not read and said nothing and let the fire do the rest. She told him in the morning, sitting at the small table with both hands around a second mug of coffee, her ankle wrapped in a bandage he had retrieved from the kit under the sink, her eyes carrying the particular flatness of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in their mind many times and was now simply executing it because the alternative had run out. Her name was Claire Ashford, 26 years old, originally from Bend, but living in Portland for the past 4 years. Most of those years spent inside a marriage that had begun with the particular intensity that she now understood was not passion, but possession wearing passion's face. His name was Marcus Webb, 44, a corporate attorney with a practice in Portland, well-regarded, well-connected, and carefully constructed. The kind of man who was charming in rooms full of people and precise in rooms with only one other person, and who understood the difference between behavior that left marks and behavior that left impressions that were harder to explain to anyone who wasn't there. She described 3 years of systematic isolation, friends who stopped calling after Marcus had spoken to them privately about her instability, family members in Bend who now referred him when they checked in on her, a bank account in her name that required his secondary authorization on any withdrawal over $200, with the measured cadence of someone reporting facts rather than seeking sympathy, which was itself a thing that told him something. There had been a doctor in Portland, Nora Hayes, who had seen Claire twice in the year before the marriage and once after, and who had written a note in Claire's file that Marcus had later cited in a conversation Claire was not supposed to have overheard as evidence of the instability described to others. Claire had not seen her since. She said she had found the documents by accident 3 weeks ago, while printing what she believed was a standard property filing from Marcus's home office printer, because his regular assistant was out sick and he had asked her to manage correspondence for the day. What printed instead? 16 pages, dense with transaction records and entity names she did not recognize, had changed the nature of her situation from personal to something larger and more dangerous than she had fully understood until she read the 4th page. The USB drive in her bag contained copies of everything. She placed it on the table between them when she said this, a small gray rectangle that sat there quietly and carried the weight of everything that had brought her to a cabin at the edge of Ridgeback Lake in the rain. Ethan looked at it for a moment before he looked at her. She said she had gone to the county sheriff's department 4 days ago and had spoken to a deputy named Ana Reyes, who had listened carefully and written everything down and whose report had disappeared from the system within 24 hours. The sheriff's name was Tom Garvey, who had attended Marcus's annual firm fundraiser for the past 6 consecutive years, whose daughter's college tuition had been underwritten by a scholarship that bore the Webb Family Foundation name. She said, "I know how that sounds." He said, "It sounds accurate." and watched something in her posture release by about 10%. The particular decompression of a person who is braced to be disbelieved and wasn't. They heard the vehicle on the access road at 2 in the afternoon, the specific sound of tires on gravel that had been disturbed rather than traveled. The kind of approach that was too deliberate to be accidental and too slow to be urgent, which meant whoever was coming had already decided what they wanted before they arrived. Ethan was at the window before the sound fully resolved, and Claire was on her feet before he reached it. The USB drive already back in the bag pressed against her side, her whole body reorganizing itself around a different kind of attention. Not the watchful conservation of the night before, but something sharper and flatter and more inward, the physical grammar of a person who knew exactly who was coming and had been running the calculations of this moment for 3 weeks. He told her to go to the back room and stay away from the windows, and she went without argument, which told him the same thing the shoulder contraction had told him the night before, only louder. 2 men. The first was tall, well-dressed despite the setting, dark wool coat, clean boots, the particular grooming of a man who understood that appearance was a form of argument. He was 40-something, with pale eyes that moved across the cabin's exterior, the way Ethan's own eyes moved across unfamiliar spaces, cataloging, not admiring. The second man, Craig Larson, according to the business card Ethan would later find he'd left on the porch rail, stood slightly behind, and to the left, the positioning of someone hired to observe rather than perform. His expression attentive in the specific way of a man who was storing things rather than reacting to them, and who wore, beneath the professional composure, the particular tight-jawed stillness of a man who had agreed to be in a place he had already decided he did not want to be. The taller man introduced himself as Marcus Webb and said that his wife had been missing for several days, that she suffered from a diagnosed anxiety disorder that sometimes caused her to make decisions that put herself in danger, that he was simply concerned for her well-being and would be grateful for any information. Every sentence was grammatically complete. Every pause was calibrated. Ethan had interviewed men like this before, not violent men, or not primarily, but controlling men, which was a different architecture entirely, and he recognized the performance for what it was, not by what was said, but by what was withheld. There was no fear in Marcus Webb's voice, no ragged edge of genuine worry, no involuntary reaching for any word that would suggest the presence of love behind the concern. There was only precision, and precision in that context was its own kind of answer. Then Marcus said, almost as an aside, that he understood Ethan had a background in federal law enforcement, and that he had a number of colleagues in the Bureau who thought very highly of the institution's capacity for internal review, and he said this pleasantly, in the tone of a man sharing a mutual interest. Ethan felt the shape of the threat land without changing his expression at all. Raven was behind him, positioned in the doorway with a stillness that was different from her ordinary alert posture, not the hackled attention of a dog responding to a stranger passing through, but the locked, tracking stillness of a working dog who had read something in the man's posture or scent that registered as threat rather than intrusion, and whose stillness said, "I have decided about this one." Ethan said he hadn't seen anyone matching that description, that the roads in the area were unreliable in wet weather, and that he hoped the search went well. He closed the door before Marcus finished his next sentence. He stood with his back against it for a moment, listening to the sound of footsteps on the porch, and then on the gravel, and then the engine turning over, and he understood with the complete clarity of a man whose entire professional training had been pointed at exactly this kind of recognition. They would be back, and next time they would not come alone. He made the decision at midnight and began moving at 4, because midnight was when clarity arrived, and 4 was when the dark was at its thickest and offered the most cover for a departure that needed to leave as few traces as possible. He packed with the economy of a man who had spent years understanding the difference between what was necessary and what was comfortable. Extra socks, water, the first aid kit, 2 days of food in a canvas pack, the sat phone he kept for emergencies, and the single photograph he had carried in the inner pocket of every jacket he'd owned for 3 years, which was not of his ex-wife or Sandra Pruitt, but of a river in Wyoming, where he had spent a week alone the summer he turned 30, before he understood what the work would cost him. Claire was already awake when he knocked on the back room door, sitting on the edge of the cot with her bag on her lap and her shoes on, and he understood that she had not slept at all, which was the appropriate response to yesterday's visit from someone who had spent 3 years learning every room of your life. He laid out the route while she laced the second shoe, 18 miles, mostly trail, avoiding Route 47 and the fire road entirely, arriving at the southeast edge of Ridgefield near the old rail depot, where the tree cover held longest. He said they were going to First Light Church, not the sheriff's office. She looked up at that, and he said, because Pastor Holloway has been running a cold weather shelter out of that building for 11 years and understands that some people have specific reasons for not wanting the first call to go to law enforcement, and because I trust him. And right now, trust is the only currency that matters. They left through the back door. Ethan covered the boot prints on the porch with a branch dragged in long, slow arcs, then followed Raven into the tree line. Finn managed the first quarter mile on his own, before his pace slowed to the particular focused determination of a small animal, who had decided that giving up was not available as an option, which Ethan noted with something that would have been amusement under different circumstances. The rain had stopped overnight, and the forest was very still, full of the kind of cold that arrived without violence and stayed without negotiating. Claire walked behind him, slightly to the right, and did not speak for the first hour, and he did not fill the silence. On the second hour, she asked why he was helping her, and he walked another 30 steps before he answered, because the true answer required him to hold it up and look at it directly for a moment before giving it to someone else, he said. Because the last time I was supposed to get somewhere in time, I didn't, and left it there, small and clean and complete, and she received it in exactly the way he intended, as information, not confession, not invitation, just the honest coordinates of where he was standing. First Light Church sat at the corner of Millard and 2nd Street in Ridgefield, a white clapboard building with a steeple that leaned slightly east in a way that had inspired 100 conversations about repair and resulted in none, and whose interior smelled of old wood and candle wax, and the particular warmth of a space that had been heated consistently by human presence for a very long time. James Holloway opened the door before Ethan knocked. He had heard the dogs on the path, he said, and had been awake since 3 in the morning when his phone had rung once and gone silent before he could answer. A number he didn't recognize, and he had sat with it afterward in the particular alertness of a man who had spent 30 years learning that calls to a church shelter number that didn't connect were sometimes not wrong numbers. He was 61, heavy-set and unhurried, with gray hair cut short above a face that had accumulated its lines through listening rather than speaking, and he stepped aside and let them in without a single question and put the kettle on with the automatic competence of a man who understood that warmth preceded everything. Dr. Nora Hayes was in the side room off the nave, where a folding table held basic medical supplies for the cold weather shelter, and she came through the door wiping her hands on a cloth and stopped completely when she saw Claire, not with surprise, but with the quiet absorption of someone processing an arrival that was both unexpected and, on some level, prepared for. She was 40 years old, dark-haired, with a particular economy of movement that belonged to people who had learned to operate under sustained emotional pressure, without burning through what was needed to keep functioning. She looked at Claire for a moment, and then she said, "I'm still here," and moved across the room to her without waiting for permission or introduction, and took her hands with the practiced gentleness of someone who had spent years learning the specific pressure of contact that communicated presence without demand. Ethan watched and said nothing, because this was the kind of moment that was diminished by narration. He had placed the USB drive on the table beside the medical kit when Deputy Anna Reyes knocked and let herself in through the side door at 7:15 in the morning, off duty, in plain clothes, with a folder under her arm and an expression that carried the specific exhaustion of a person who had been carrying something heavy for 4 days and had just arrived at the place where she could finally set it down. She looked at Ethan first, measuring him in a single unhurried assessment, and then at Claire, and something in her face shifted toward a quality that was not quite apology, but contained the same essential acknowledgement of a debt owed. She opened the folder on the table. Inside was a photocopy of a report, dated 4 days earlier, with her case number and Claire's name at the top, and below it a handwritten note in a second ink. Copy retained, original file 1014, confirmed deleted 1015, signature T. Garvey. She said she had known the report would disappear and had kept the copy because she did not know yet what to do with it, and that she had been waiting for the thing that would make the next step possible. She looked at the USB drive on the table and said, "I think that might be it." Marcus Webb arrived at First Light at 9:47 in the morning with a man introduced as his attorney, a printed temporary restraining order, citing Claire's diagnosed anxiety disorder and Ethan's interference with a domestic matter, and the specific composure of a man who believed, on the basis of substantial prior evidence, that composure was sufficient armor for any situation. He was wrong, but he did not know that yet, and the not knowing was visible in the way he held the restraining order with a confidence that was actually the last fully intact structure of an architecture that had already begun, quietly and elsewhere, to come apart. Agent Dana Polk came through the rear door of the church at 9:52, showed her credentials to Marcus's attorney, and advised Marcus that he was being detained for questioning in connection with a federal financial investigation. Referencing case numbers that Ethan did not recognize, but that caused Marcus's attorney to take a very deliberate step backward and begin looking at his phone. Ethan stood near the far wall and watched Marcus's composure perform a slow, specific dismantling, not dramatic, not sudden, but the precise withdrawal of expression that happened when a person whose entire operational model depended on controlling the information other people had was confronted with the fact that the information had gotten away from him. It was, Ethan reflected, one of the more honest things he had ever seen Marcus Webb do. Polk had spoken to him briefly the evening before, through a phone call he had not answered immediately because he did not recognize the number, and she had said, "I've been watching you for 6 weeks, and I've seen enough to know that what you're doing is right, and how you're doing it is wrong by Bureau standards, and I need you to understand both of those things clearly before I tell you what I'm about to do." She had transmitted the USB contents to the Portland field office at 2 in the morning, flagging it as time-sensitive evidence in an active domestic threat situation and requesting an expedited preliminary review, not a full financial investigation, which would take weeks, but enough to confirm that what was on the drive was what it appeared to be, and to justify a federal hold. Craig Larson, who had been sitting in his car on Millard Street since 6 a.m., having walked away from Marcus Webb's employment the previous evening without explanation, had provided a signed statement that corroborated 3 transaction records already identified in the preliminary review. He had been Marcus's hired investigator for 8 months, brought in originally to locate a witness in an unrelated civil case, and what he had been asked to document in the months since had crossed the line he had drawn privately and silently, and was now, finally, drawing out loud. The number he called at 2:15 belonged to a contact at the Oregon State Bar Ethics Division, which was enough, combined with Anna Reyes's documented report deletion and the established connection between Sheriff Garvey and Marcus Webb, to justify detaining Marcus Webb for questioning pending the full investigation. After Marcus was escorted out, Claire sat in the front pew with Raven's head in her lap and did not speak for several minutes, and nobody asked her to. Ethan sat 2 rows behind her, not close enough to intrude, close enough to be there, which was a distinction that mattered enormously and that he understood in his bones. Polk sat beside him eventually and said, "The Bureau wants you back," and he said, "I know," and did not say anything else. The weeks after Marcus Webb's arrest were quieter than Ethan had expected, and louder in the ways he had not anticipated. The procedural noise of statements and follow-up interviews and evidence documentation, the administrative weight of Polk's reports and the county attorney's requests, the particular texture of days organized around other people's timelines rather than his own, which was disorienting in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. because disorientation implied that his equilibrium existed to be disturbed, which implied that he had an equilibrium, which was something he had not been fully certain of for some time. Claire worked with Nora, and a trauma specialist from Portland, whose name Ethan did not learn because she did not offer it, and he did not ask, and he saw Claire 3 or 4 times a week in ways that were functional rather than deliberate, at the church, at the small motel where she was staying, while her situation was being organized. Once, at the county attorney's office, where they both gave statements in adjacent rooms and nodded to each other in the hallway with the specific mutual recognition of people who had been through something together and were now figuring out what that meant separately. She did not need him to reconstruct herself, and he was grateful for it, because the kind of help that made itself necessary was not help but a different form of the same problem she had just escaped. One Thursday afternoon, Finn was sleeping on the porch of the cabin in a patch of afternoon sun when Ethan came back from the East Trail, and there was a manila envelope on the kitchen table that had not been there when he left, weighted down by the coffee mug that had been on the counter. He opened it and found the internal review from the Harlow case, not the executive summary he had read once and closed, but the full report, 83 pages, with the final section tabbed with a strip of paper that had a single line written on it in Polk's handwriting. You should read to the end. He read it standing at the kitchen table while the afternoon shifted to evening, and when he reached the section he had never seen, the findings regarding the withheld communication log, the supervisor's name, the documented timeline of what had been available and when and to whom, he sat down in the chair nearest him and did not move for a long time. He had been the one paying for it. That was the specific shape of the understanding when it arrived. Not that he was innocent of failure, because being given incomplete information still produced an incomplete response, but that he had been running a private conviction in a court where the evidence had been contaminated from the start. He did not know, until later, that Polk had driven the envelope out to the cabin herself on a Thursday morning when she knew from his routine that he would be on the East Trail, that she had left it on the table, weighted down by the coffee mug that was already there, and that it had been Claire who told her to do it that way. Claire who had said, when Polk asked whether she wanted to be present when Ethan read it, no, he needs to read that alone, in his own space, and she had said it with the particular certainty of someone who understood, from the inside, what it meant to be handed information that restructured the shape of your own history. Spring came late to the Cascade Range that year, arriving not as an event but as a series of small surrenders. Patches of snow retreating from south-facing slopes, the creek behind the cabin running higher and louder, mornings that began cold and arrived at something warmer by midday, the particular quality of light through young leaves that was greener than any other green Ethan could name. He was standing on the porch with coffee that was actually still hot when Nora Hayes' car turned off the access road and parked beside the woodpile, and he watched her get out with the ease of someone who had been to this place enough times that it had stopped being unfamiliar and started being a place she simply came to. She had been coming to the cabin since February, at first to check on Finn's development, because she had a secondary certification in veterinary first aid that she brought up, casually, the third time she visited, and that had nothing to do with any of her subsequent visits, and then because she was a person who found it easier to begin things sideways rather than directly, which was a tendency he shared entirely, and which had resulted in something that neither of them had formally named, but that both of them had stopped pretending was not there. She leaned against the porch rail beside him, and they watched Raven work the edge of the tree line in the methodical quarter-mile loop. She ran every morning, and after a while, Nora said she had heard from Claire, who had confirmed the lease on a small office space on Millard Street, 3 doors down from First Light. Ethan had known the name before she said it, Raven House. He had not known until Nora told him that the operating grant had been partially funded through the civil forfeiture attached to Marcus Webb's case, which was a piece of information that landed with a particular completeness, the way the final element of a pattern arrived and made every preceding element suddenly more legible. Finn appeared from the far side of the woodpile at a run, skidded on the wet porch boards, collided gently with Ethan's leg, and retreated with the dignity of an animal who had intended exactly that. It was the last full week Finn spent at the cabin. The decision arrived the way the best decisions sometimes did, not as a conclusion, but as a recognition of something already true. Claire had been coming to the cabin 2 or 3 times a week through March and into April, and Finn had attached himself to her from her second visit with the indiscriminate but absolute loyalty of a young dog who had found the specific frequency of a person and decided, without consultation, that this was his person now. On the Tuesday in the 3rd week of April, when Claire stood to leave, and Finn stationed himself at the door beside her with an expression of complete and unambiguous intent, Claire had looked back at Ethan with a question in her expression, and Ethan had looked at Raven, who was watching from her place by the stove with an attention that held no distress, only the calm acknowledgement of a dog whose work in a particular direction was finished. And he had nodded once, and Claire had nodded back, and Finn had gotten in the car. Raven came back to the porch and sat beside Ethan's chair. The morning was clear, the mountains visible above the tree line, the lake flat and gray-blue and perfectly still in the way it got before a wind arrived from the north. He had sent Polk's office a signed agreement for the consulting arrangement the previous week, his terms, his location, his timeline, which Bureau had accepted without counteroffer, which told him something about how the 6 weeks of observation had concluded. He had not yet told Nora, and she had not yet asked, and both of them understood that some things were more real for being carried quietly a little while longer before being said. Raven put her chin on his knee. He set his hand on her head, felt the steady warmth there, and looked at the lake, and the morning held everything it needed to hold. Not resolved, exactly, not finished, but aligned. Moving forward in the direction of something he did not yet have a complete name for, which was fine, because he had learned, slowly and at considerable cost, that the most important things rarely announce themselves clearly in advance. They arrive the way spring arrived, in small surrenders, in the gradual retreat of what had been covering them. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell me which moment hit hardest, and let me know where in the world you are watching from.